So what I'm mainly going to do today with my props, I've worked hard for these, so I'd like to carry them around, is tell you stories. I hadn't really thought in terms of stories, but it turns out if you spend 17 years at the Wall Street Journal and live in New York, Chicago, Brussels, New York, San Francisco, Mexico City, and San Francisco, and you're at the Wall Street Journal, you meet a couple of people. And it turns out some of those have been rather interesting people because I started covering the world of technology really in 1986 with the Wall Street Journal and have more or less been doing that sort of thing since then. I actually thought I was late to the party because the IBM PC had been out for 5 years. But then on my second night on the beat, somebody said, hey, do you want to have this guy who was just on the cover of Fortune magazine, name's Bill Gates? I said, sure. So I wound up getting to know Gates quite well and a whole bunch of other people. So over the years, I've wound up probably having more meals with Gates than I could count. Had lunch with Steve Jobs once, interviewed him another time. I have corresponded with Warren Buffett. I actually have a letter he sent at one point where he acknowledged in a very Warren Buffett sort of way how he had screwed up, as I had pointed out he had screwed up. He said that was probably the biggest mistake he'd ever made and he was sure he'd make a bigger one soon. I had a cigar with Carlos Slim, who sometimes shows up on these lists as the richest guy in the world, back when I was running the Mexico City Bureau for the Wall Street Journal. So I've been around a little bit. I finally became convinced of the value of some of these stories when my friend Scott Schall, who many of you know, told a story in front of me for about the 50th time about a time when I had said that Peter Drucker, the management guru and writer, had said something. Scott asked if I could find the citation because he wanted to use it, and I looked it up and found he'd said it to me. I figured if I was quoting myself, then maybe I had been around a little bit. What I'm going to do is start with some research, just to sort of ground what I'm saying in some hard-won reality. With this book in particular, my co-author and I spent 5 years working on the book. The idea was to be the flip side of Jim Collins, because he would write about success stories after a bunch of research and say, here's how to be like those guys. And we realized that nobody had ever done a book looking at failures and said, here's how not to be like those guys. So we got 20 researchers and we spent 2 years looking at 2,500 failures to look at the patterns and then came up with some lessons out of that. So I'll start with that sort of research and then get into something that's sort of a combination of the research and then some observations. And then I'll close with some thoughts based on those observations that I hope are a little different than some of the other things you've heard that maybe would help you be on the success side and not the failure side. In a lot of ways, all this that I'm going to describe today is something that I've been thinking about for about 30 years. And it all goes back to the cafeteria in the Wall Street Journal headquarters in New York, which in a lot of ways turns out to be the center of the universe, if you're at least in financial journalism, because the Wall Street Journal is the biggest publication, most prestigious publication, and New York is where it's based. And New York is also where all the analysts and so forth are. So the guys who are, say, out in San Francisco covering technology would see their folks, but I would see, being based in New York at this point, covering IBM, not only the New York area folks, but anybody who would come through to talk to analysts. So I would just go to the cafeteria 2 or 3 times a day, and Scott McNeely, who was the CEO of Sun at the time, would show up, and he was always a hoot, so we'd sit down and talk. Or Michael Dell would show up. I always found him sort of interesting because almost all these guys had entourages. But with Dell, he would just show up, and he'd knock on the window to get the attention of the receptionist and say, is Paul around? And we'd go up and have a cup of coffee, just the two of us and his cell phone. I finally realized he was probably recording the conversation just to make sure I didn't quote him out of context. But anyway, it was just Michael and his cell phone. And one of the things that struck me was that the difference between success and failure was really small. There were lots of times when I'd meet with startups, and they'd be really bright, impressive people. And then I'd meet with a McNeely or a Dell or a John Young, who was CEO at Hewlett-Packard at the time, or whatever. And I thought, well, what's the difference? And I'll get into some of the things that I think are the differences and some of the things I think are not the differences. But it always just sort of puzzled me because it was such a fine line. Over the years, I got to know Mitch Kapor reasonably well. And he, to me, symbolized this fine line. Because he's a name who, probably not many of you remember the name. He was a very big deal, on a par with Bill Gates back in the late 80s and early 90s. Because he was the founder of Lotus, the spreadsheet fame. And he started out, went to Yale, bright guy, but was sort of a child of the 60s and smoked a lot of pot and drove a taxi for a while and taught transcendental meditation and did a bunch of other stuff while he tried to figure out what he was going to do with his life. And he was always sort of interested in computers. So when the homebrew club stuff was starting up with Jobs and Wozniak and so forth, he bought an Apple II. And he went home and he played with it. And then the next day he went back into the shop because he needed a part. And there was somebody standing there at the counter asking a question. And the guy behind the counter didn't know how to answer it, so the customer said, well, do you know anybody who consults on Apple IIs? And Mitch said, I do. Well, he'd owned an Apple II for exactly one day, but he was a little bit ahead of this other guy, and he managed to answer the guy's question. And he thought that was kind of fun, so he started doing some consulting, and that got him into the flow of things in the computer industry. And then he got hired by a company called Software Arts that did the first spreadsheet. And he had a better idea, and they didn't want to do it, so they said, go ahead and go off and do that on your own. So he started Lotus, and actually got bored with it, which is part of the reason you haven't heard of him. Left and did some investing that made him even more money. Lotus was eventually bought by IBM for about $1.5 billion. And did a bunch of other stuff, and the last time I saw him, he's got 2 floors on an office building in San Francisco for the Mitch Kapor Foundation. But the line between success and failure, I mean, he could easily have not bought the Apple II that day or whatever, and nobody ever would have heard of him. This spreadsheet would have eventually happened, but in fact, Mitch has gone on to have pretty significant impact in a lot of other ways. Any of you who are fans of Wikipedia owe a reasonable amount of that to Mitch, because he was one of 2 guys who put up pretty much all the money in the early days before they managed to figure out how to take donations from people. For those of you who care about privacy, Mitch is also one of 3 founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which has been the biggest group advocating for privacy for people. So all I'm trying to say is that I find this to be a fascinating question and have spent most of the last 30 years thinking about this in one form or another. And I'll go into this a little bit. So as I say, this is the research. We spent probably 5 years between the research and the writing on this book. It came out in 2008, got unbelievable reviews. The Wall Street Journal review was better than I would have written if I had written the review for the Journal. So that it was sort of good news, bad news. It came out in September of 2008, which was a time when everybody was willing to take a look at the sorts of lessons in this book. The bad news was that it came out in the midst of the Great Recession, and people were really thinking about how to run a company better. They were wondering if they had a company or even if we had an economy. So this book has given us a lot of credibility, but has been sort of under the radar. This is the Killer Apps, New Killer Apps, is an update of sorts that came out in December. It really combines the sort of research on failures that we did in this book, along with some work that Chunka had done previously. He and another guy wrote a book called Unleashing the Killer App. It was sort of the Bible of the internet. It came out in 1998. So this is basically about how to innovate without screwing up in ways that would land you in this book. I won't go through all the stuff. I could spend hours talking about this book, but in terms of the substance, I'll just point out 4 things. One is that we were quite surprised as we went through the failures to find that 46% of them were obviously dumb strategies. I mean, a lot of these things were not even close. There was Blue Circle Cement, which was one of the biggest cement companies in the world, and it decided it was really a home products company, so it ought to make boilers and lawnmowers. So they made a lot of lawnmowers and couldn't sell them and eventually went bankrupt and were bought by somebody else. Avon decided that it wasn't really about its sales force, it was about what they called a culture of caring. So they went off and bought a medical equipment business and retirement homes and lost their shirts and sold them off a couple years later. So in a lot of cases, these are just clearly dumb ideas. In terms of the patterns that we saw, there were 7 strategies that were most commonly associated with failure. It's kind of interesting because some of these turn out to be cyclical. You'll hear a lot about synergies for a while, and then you won't for a while, and then you will and you won't. I think synergy's been pretty well killed for a while by the AOL Time Warner deal, which was the biggest bust in history. But I have no doubt that if you give it 5 years or whatever, you're going to see some more of those again. Adjacencies were also sometimes potentially very powerful, but also sometimes a real problem, such as with Avon, where they decided that retirement homes were kind of close to cosmetics, and it didn't turn out that way. In general terms, if you get away from the strategies, the biggest mistake that people made was confusing size with scale. They would think, well, we have all these fixed expenses at headquarters. If we just get more revenue, we'll keep the headquarters operation about the same size, spread those costs over a bigger business, and we'll be more profitable. Well, it turns out if you make 100 widgets and then you go to making 200 widgets, that's scale. You know how to do that. Nothing changes. You get more efficient as you get bigger, at least in most cases. But if you make widgets and you decide you're going to make cosmetics, that doesn't work so well, because the complexity that comes with running 2 different kinds of businesses tends to overwhelm things. And I will add that one of the things that's always bugged me about business books is that if you go back 5 years later and look at the examples that they use, a lot of the great examples don't hold up so well. I mean, this is even true with Jim Collins' books, and I respect Collins. But if you go back and look at Good to Great, for instance, he sings the praises of Circuit City, which is long gone, Fannie Mae, which is long gone, and I have forgotten, but he had, I think, 13 examples, and 2 of them were total busts, and about 5 others you would not include on anybody's list of best businesses these days. So just to make sure that what we were doing was predictive and not just Monday morning quarterbacking, we actually did a blog where we would look at strategies being announced, deals that we're going through, and would predict failure or success, and had almost 100% track record of success in terms of identifying. We weren't commenting on every strategy, so we got to cherry pick a little bit, but in a lot of cases, as I say, some of these things were pretty obvious. So the solution, in general terms, turns out to be what we call a devil's advocate. Anytime we've gone in and done some consulting, we've found that loads of people knew that an idea was stupid. They just didn't have any way to tell folks. So the trick turns out to be to find a way to get past the normal politics, the normal dynamics of a business, and get all the objections raised. Because you don't need to do humongous studies or whatever to find these problems. There are loads of people in the organization who know what the problems are. I'll very quickly say 3 things that are covered in some degree here, in more degree here, that I would suggest along those lines. Of the various exercises we have people do, the 3 that people have rallied around the most that would help you identify strategic problems are what we call the doomsday scenario, a clean sheet of paper, and then future history. A doomsday scenario is where you would get people in a room and say, okay, we're not doing anything predictive. We're just going to come up with a scenario that would put us out of business. So you tell people, all right, you have unlimited financing. People are pulling you together. You just need to come up with a way to put your current company out of business. And people actually find it fun, and they get very creative, and they compete to see who can come up with the most outrageous ideas. And it gets past the normal stuff. One of the stories we tell in here at length is about Kodak. And Kodak actually in the early 2000s tried to do a doomsday scenario. And their doomsday scenario was that revenue would only increase 10% a year, and earnings would only go up 5% a year. And 10 years later, they filed for bankruptcy. So the tendency is to do a sort of bad scenario, not a doomsday scenario, and what you need to do is find a way to change the dynamics so you can get to a doomsday scenario. The flip side of that is the clean sheet of paper, where you say, okay, let's say we're looking at 5 years, 10 years. What is the best form of our current business that we could have? And you don't worry about current customers, you don't worry about your people, you don't worry about anything. You just imagine what could happen in the future. And again, people enjoy that sort of exercise, they get competitive, you wind up getting a lot of great ideas out of it. And then you can sort of think, all right, if that's the idealized form of the future, how do we start thinking about getting there? The third one is future histories, which is actually what we've done the most. And it's a way of really consolidating all these other things. What you do is you say you're 5 years in the future and you're looking back. And in one case in the future, you've succeeded terrifically, and in the other, you've failed miserably. Again, the tendency is to sort of think that the failed miserably is only the 10% growth a year and so forth. We did one of these for the CEO of Allstate, and his worst case scenario was flat stock price over 5 years. So you have to sort of get past that. But when you do this sort of future history, it puts everything in context, right? People can understand stories much better than they can data. So if you you get to include all the data and so forth, but when you do something, people can sort of say, oh, that's why we might fail. That's something we ought to watch out for. Or, oh, that turned out to be a key ingredient to the success. That's the kind of thing we need to make happen rather than just sit back and hope it happens. So enough of that, and we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if you want to hear any more about that or whatever, let me know. But that is my very quick summary of 5 years of my life. In terms of observation, this is actually one that struck me a fair amount, because when I used to hire a lot of people, my main criteria was just to get the smartest people I could. Because I sort of felt like, in the same way in sports, people say you can't teach speed. I felt like you couldn't teach intelligence. And it mostly worked. But if you look at these guys, these are two of the brightest and in some ways most successful people you could ever find. This gentleman, if I can show it, is George Fisher. And if any of you are familiar with the quality movement or Six Sigma, he's basically the reason you've heard of that. Ivy League schools, PhD in engineering, something other in mathematics, wound up at Motorola at a time when people were thinking that the Japanese were going to kill us, especially in consumer electronics. And his operation was actually so good in Japan that Motorola was beating the Japanese in their home country. So he came back, eventually became CEO of Motorola, really launched the whole craze of Six Sigma and quality in the US. Back in the 80s, people were sort of saying, well, who's the better CEO, Fisher or Jack Welch at GE? Well, he turns out to be the biggest villain in this book, because while he was at Motorola, he managed to preside over Iridium, which was a satellite phone venture that just on its face was stupid. I mean, first of all, you have the latency issues, because it'll take about half a second or close for a signal to travel to a satellite and back. And then satellite phones don't work very well in buildings, right? You have satellite dishes on the outside of buildings, not inside buildings. So the technology just wasn't going to work. It was going to be wildly expensive. He spent $5 billion on this. Iridium went bankrupt, and the assets were auctioned off for about $25 million. Super bright guy. The other fellow is Steve Ballmer, who, again, I got to know quite well. I found his downfall as CEO of Microsoft probably even more fascinating, because most of what I learned in my early days as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal about how bureaucracies could screw things up came from Ballmer. He and Gates would meet with the IBM folks, and again, I covered IBM at that point, and they would be so angry that they wouldn't even make it back to an office. They'd call me from a payphone in White Plains to basically yell at me about the stupid stuff that IBM was doing. Harvard degree, mathematics, super successful. I had friends who actually went to Stanford Business School with him, and they said it was just crazy how dominant he was as a student. The consulting firms would come in, and they weren't allowed to recruit the first year, so they would do contests where people would write papers. And Ballmer won every single one of them. He won McKinsey, Bain, Booz, you name it. And I had great hopes for him. He was really my contact with Microsoft when I did my book on IBM. I would meet him about 7 in the morning. And as a quick aside, I always liked his personality. Some people weren't so wild about it, but he was known as Boom Boom Ballmer because he was just this big personality. He actually had to learn how to bellow without hurting his voice because he had hurt his voice a bunch of times. And when I was at Microsoft, he would, in the morning at about 7, come in with a box of documents and say, okay, this is what you're going to see today, and this is who I'm going to bring in and have you meet. And then I was in this little conference room, and he had an office across the hall. Microsoft was a very hierarchical sort of system where status mattered a lot, and he very intentionally, even though he was the number 2 guy to Gates at that point, took the smallest office that he could have. But that meant that he was in there, and he was banging on the walls, and I could hear him screaming, and it was just crazy. The floor would shake across the hall from where he was. And I thought he was the kind of personality who could shake up Microsoft. But he basically has presided over a flat stock price for the last 12 years and retired early because he couldn't hack it. So again, I cannot imagine. I've dealt much more with Ballmer than I have with Fisher, but I cannot imagine 2 smarter people, and yet they are 2 of the more prominent screw-ups of recent times. I jumped? No, I didn't. Okay. But intelligent matters. Gates is a remarkably bright guy and remarkably broad. He will go on vacation and sit on the beach with 20 books on biology. I saw him, I had dinner with him one time at a conference 20 plus years ago. And the organizer of the conference was actually prescient because she brought in somebody who'd written a book on nanotechnology, which is kind of passing into the language today, but this is probably almost 25 years ago, was not nearly so well known. And this guy, Eric Drexler, who was the world's expert on nanotechnology, got into a conversation with Gates, and Gates basically, he won. I mean, it was quite clear to all of us at the table that this guy, Drexler, was predicting that things would happen too quickly. So one of the conundrums to me is that intelligence matters, but it's not enough. Charisma isn't enough either. People talk about jobs and so forth. This is me shaking hands with Carlos Salinas, who at the time was president of Mexico. And if you had asked me who the 4 or 5 most impressive people I ever met were, he was one of them. Harvard, spoke better English than I did, but would joke around. There was one time when there were 4 or 5 of us who were traveling with him on the Mexican version of Air Force One, and he was sort of laughing at this woman who was the Time magazine reporter because she was correcting him on all sorts of things. He kept referring to her as Heffa, or boss. But he turns out to be a crook and probably a murderer and a whole bunch of other things, and was basically chased out of the country and is now in exile in Ireland. His idea was to open up the Mexican economy, and he was the darling of the developing world, because back, he was president from 88 to 94. Back at that stretch, there were a lot of other Latin American economies that were trying to follow him and open up. But as I say, he's one of the most charismatic people I've ever met, and that didn't do it. But charisma matters. So my introduction to Steve Jobs was probably the best entrance I've ever seen. He was in his days in the wilderness. He'd been forced out of Apple but wasn't back yet, so he had started Next and was trying to sell people at the Wall Street Journal on writing about Next. So he shows up in New York, and about 10 of us had lunch with him in the executive dining room, because even then he was Steve Jobs. I mean, he wasn't Steve Jobs the way he became Steve Jobs, but he was still a big deal. And so he walks in the days before his black turtlenecks, and he's wearing the best looking suit I've ever seen. I mean, this must have been a $10,000 suit. It was just beautiful. And he looks around, sees that we're all sitting there with our suit coats off. So he takes his coat off and then looks around to see where he can hang it. Doesn't see anything, so he wads it up and throws it in the corner. So it's basically, I'm way wealthier than you are, I have way better taste than you do, and who cares? people talked about his reality distortion field, and I can vouch for that, if only because in this lunch, there were two guys who were two of the 10 best journalists I've ever met. One guy won a Pulitzer Prize. The other guy was more on the editing side, but was probably even more impressive. And they were just salivating over jobs. I mean, they were so determined that we ought to write something about the great success that Next was going to be, that the other guy who actually covered a computer beat and I had to pull these guys aside afterward and say, wait a minute. And of course, Next turned out to be a big failure. Colin Powell is one I got to interview, and he would be on my top 5 list of most charismatic people. I did an interview with him for the cover of a magazine that I had at that point, and he was great during the interview, but I thought the charisma even showed through more in the photo shoot that we did. This was back in the film days, and I had this very extreme designer for the magazine, who actually these days is the creative director at Rolling Stone. And Mark believed in extreme close-ups. Well, when you have film, you need to have a big piece of film. So each shot was one 8.5 by 11 sheet of film, which meant you had to have a lot. So we did this stuff inside. We had him for about 45 minutes, and then we were going to go outside. And Powell, at the beginning, had gone around and introduced himself to the 6 or 7 people in this crew, asked their names, remembered their names, referred to them by name every time after that. As we were going outside, there was a young woman who was going to pick up this big crate of film. And Powell said, I can't let you do that. And she said, it's my job. I need to do that. And he said, no, I can't let you do that. She said, well, we need to run outside. And he said, that's fine, I'm good with that. So there's Colin Powell in his suit coat and tie, picking up this 50-pound thing, and he's running out into the woods just because it was the chivalrous thing to do. So there are loads of things that went into his rise through the military, but I would bet that charisma was a big piece of that. I would say if I had to boil everything down, that the thing that matters most is context. I actually believe in that enough that when I did this thought leadership magazine with a consulting firm in the mid-90s through the early 2000s, I called it Context. This gentleman with a computer in his hands, can't do that, is Alan Kay, who as much as anybody invented the PC. He led the group at Xerox PARC that did Windows. If you know programming at all, object-oriented programming was his idea and is more important than Windows and some other things. His context, and he supplied the line for the magazine name. He says that context is worth 80 IQ points. And Alan is a very bright fellow, but I think if you look at some of the stuff he's done, it's superhuman. I actually at one point, this goes back quite a few years, had thought that people who were losing their car keys ought to have some way to just put a little something on the key so it would chirp anytime you wanted to find them. And a guy who knew Alan said, Alan Kay had that idea 20 years ago. He said, but if you're only 20 years behind Alan Kay, you're actually doing really well. Alan, back in the late 60s, envisioned basically your laptop of today. I mean, he envisioned it as battery-powered, connected to the internet, even though the internet didn't exist, with the equivalent of Wikipedia, even though Wikipedia didn't exist, and basically designed the PC to that spec. I was at a lunch one time where Alan was talking with Peter Drucker and actually told Drucker that Drucker was the one who had supplied the context, because Drucker, back in the 60s, was writing about knowledge workers. And Alan, who was a huge Drucker fan, or is a huge Drucker fan, said that he thought, okay, so you're right, knowledge workers are where we're going. Well, what tools do they need? And then based on that, what tools can I give them? And there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, because I had to look at where technology was going. So, you know, if you had a black and white screen that wasn't bitmapped, so you couldn't do all the little pixels, you just sort of had waves on the screen and so forth. If you could be in that sort of world and project out to the laptops that became available to us 10 or 15 years ago, that takes some remarkable understanding of the computer science. But it was basically the context that set him up to do that. He actually did it a second time because he was a consultant at Apple when they did a film about what they called the Knowledge Navigator. There was really an iPad. And that film came out, it was a big deal at the time, John Scully used it a lot. It was describing a vision of the future, and as it turns out, the demo that they had done with someone supposedly using this knowledge navigator was set 3 months before the iPad actually came out. So if you have the right context, you can get it right. The other fellow is Jim Canavino, who ran IBM's PC business for a long time, and is actually a great, charismatic story. Only went through high school, turned out to have a great work ethic, decided that he needed a way to support his young family as a 19 or 20-year-old, lived in a kind of crummy suburb west of Chicago, decided he was going to take a bus toward the city, and wherever the bus ended, he was going to get off and he was going to find a job. So it happened that he was dumped right in front of an IBM branch in the early 60s, right as IBM was gearing up for what's called the System 360, which revolutionized mainframes and required all kinds of technical assistance. Got a job at IBM, worked his way up, ran the mainframe business. If things had shaken out a little differently, could have been CEO of IBM. But he had the wrong context. When it came to dealing with Bill Gates, Canavino's context was these machines in rooms this size or bigger, liquid cooled, with sort of a priesthood of people walking around in white lab coats, where if it took 5 minutes for a computer to boot up or whatever, that was no problem. So he just had the wrong context, and when Gates came along, Gates basically ate his lunch, and he wound up being the big villain in my first book on IBM, and has done nothing since he left IBM. So if you get the context right, you get an awful lot right. So I'll try to go through this really quickly, because I see I'm already into the 10 minutes we were going to allot for questions. So this sort of relates to the issue of context. I think a big thing is to make sure that you're playing in the right sandbox. This is a somewhat old picture, so you might not recognize that that's Mark Cuban. As it happens, he went to my high school. He's a year younger than I am. I had no idea who he was in high school. I was with the AP crowd. He hung out in what people euphemistically referred to as the smoking area. And yet he played in the right sandbox. He was a very entrepreneurial fellow, kept trying stuff. If you actually think about it, the company that made him all his money, broadcast.com, was a dumb idea. I mean, video on the internet, yep, but he was about 10 years too early, and he wasn't the only one who was going to have that idea. But Yahoo came along and bought him, and he was smart enough to see the internet bubble bursting, so he sold in time to make a bunch of money, and now he's got the Mavericks and Shark Tank and all kinds of crazy stuff. And between us, we're worth about $2.2 billion, and that's not me. Another thing is to very aggressively look for problems, and I think Gates is a great example of this. When I did my book on IBM in 1993, I spent a week up at Microsoft, and just for fun, Gates let me sit in on a couple of product reviews. And if you've ever gone through something like that, it's mostly just about how great the product is and how you're going to kill the competition. And even to the extent that they're metrics, they tend to be about how that product is doing. Well, the first half of both these meetings that I sat in on with Gates were all about what's the competition doing. It was rumors, what do you think they can do, how could they hurt us, and so forth. So it was all about the context, and he was very aggressively looking for problems. He also is sort of interesting because while he has a reputation for being very biting and for telling people how stupid they are, he'll take it as well. I mean, in one of those meetings, he said something, and some young programmer said, "Bill, that's really just stupid." And they argued about it for a while, and Gates acknowledged at the end with kind of a smile on his face that, yep, he was wrong and the other guy was right. So look for problems. Be willing to be different. I'll gloss over these because these are both me. On the left, this actually started out as a personal thing. I had a friend who was organizing a transatlantic sailboat race, and even though I'd never sailed before, I signed on for the trip. It took us 27 days. The boat almost broke up in the middle of the Atlantic, and it was a mess. But it was great fun, and it sort of got me a reputation around the paper. People looked at that picture on the left, which is 1,500 miles from anywhere, and basically said, you could probably kill a man with your bare hands now, couldn't you? Then I got a reputation as a daredevil. I actually went to a school for professional wrestlers and wrestled a match on cable TV. And if you're in a news operation with, my name was the Wall Street Warrior, and those are pinstripe tights, as you can maybe tell. So anyway, you have to find ways to stand out in a newsroom with 600 or 700 reporters, and that was my effort. So don't take yourself too seriously. This is a picture you've probably all seen of the Situation Room where they're waiting to get word about whether they had found bin Laden. And the reason I put this up here is that at one point, I can't seem to get this to work, the gentleman who's standing behind Obama wearing the tie is Mike Mullen, who at the time was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I had met him when he was the chief naval officer. We actually spoke at a conference together, and he was kind enough to stick around for the full 3 days of the conference. So I bumped into him a few times at the coffee machine. And I still can't quite believe how self-deprecating he was. He talked about being invited to the president's prayer breakfast and said he wasn't quite sure, but he figured why he was invited, but figured that was sort of part of his new status as the chief naval officer. This was about 2 months before he was named chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he said he looked at the invitation and thought, Bono is speaking. I thought he died in a skiing accident 10 years ago. He had no idea who Bono was and was happy to admit that. So I think you can go a long way. Certainly the folks I've dealt with have gone a long way, partly by not taking themselves too seriously. I was going to go on a little bit more about this, but in the interest of time, I'll be quick. It's cheating to call her a child care executive. That is an article in the Wall Street Journal that describes her as such. The reason I say it's cheating is because my brother and I wrote that, and that's our mother. And I've sort of thought about this a lot. I'm one of 8 kids, and it's by and large a very successful family. I realized the other day that we kind of divided into 4 really good students and 4 students who were not as good. And if you look at the 4 failures, if you will, one of them has a master's degree and has a small business. Another is a lawyer. Third is a PhD. And the 4th is my younger brother, who's coming up on 32 years at the Wall Street Journal. So if those are the black sheep of the family, you're kind of doing okay. And the reason is that she worked very hard to find the on button. I first heard that term from a guy who was the head baseball coach at Cal, who described a pitcher who had been wonderfully talented, but a head case when he was at Cal, got drafted by the Minnesota Twins and went on to have an almost Hall of Fame career. So this guy found somebody at the Twins and said, what changed? And the answer was, we found the on button. Because once you find the on button, and this is more about people who work for you as opposed to things you would do, once you find the on button, all kinds of other things take care of themselves. In my family, the on button was the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle. And I've never really asked, but I think my parents orchestrated this. They loved doing the puzzle, and if you have 8 kids, things are chaotic. So when we'd come back from church on Sundays, we'd have lunch, and then the half hour that was supposed to belong to my parents was when they would sit down and do the Sunday Times crossword puzzle. Well, my older brother, I'm a second of the 8 kids, very bright guy, decided he had to contribute. And there he was, he's 10 years old or whatever, he's trying to help with the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle, and eventually he got one. Well, then he got 2, and that meant I had to get one. And everybody just piled on until it finally became a real disadvantage to be the one writing, because you couldn't write fast enough to keep up with all the answers that people were calling out to you. And I think that, defined a couple things about my family. One, it was, the basic thing, it was cool to be smart. And we basically competed to see who could be smarter. So I brushed through this a little bit, but as I say, I realize I've mostly told you stories. I've tried to be reasonably prescriptive because I have seen a lot of failure and a lot of success. And I think that if you don't count too much on intelligence, be smart, but don't assume that's going to solve all the problems. be charismatic, but don't assume that you can just sort of, talk your way out of everything. Look for problems. I've forgotten all of them. Find the on button and the other couple things I mentioned. But most of all, just make sure that you understand the context in which you and your business are operating. Because if you understand that context, you're going to be way more aware and way more likely to be on the success side than the failure side. So I've gone long. Why don't we steal a few minutes for questions? I know we've got the tour going. I answered all the questions.
Paul, share the story about Bill Gates in the suit.
Yeah, actually, so this first night I had dinner with Bill Gates. He's an interesting character. He fidgets. It's actually kind of funny when he and Ballmer get together, because Gates fidgets back and forward and Ballmer goes side to side. So they're quite a pair. So there we are. We're actually at the windows on the world at the top of the World Trade Center, so no longer there. And it's this really nice restaurant. I've never met Gates before, and I'm finding it disorienting because you ask him a question and his eyes glaze over. He's gone. And I thought, all right, I'm boring him or something. And it turned out that his mind is just so hyperactive that he's thinking about other stuff, but he was still listening to the question. And he would give a very detailed, thoughtful response, but he's distracted. So, as I told Roy, he asked at this very nice restaurant, he asked the waitress whether the chilled mint pea soup was served cold. He actually later, I think the last time I had dinner with him, it turns out he really sort of likes cheap food. One of the best things we did at the Journal, first of all, was to buy that first dinner, because I was there with one other guy, and Gates wasn't used to having people buy. We told him he was going to look more impressive on our expense account than we would on his, so we were going to buy. And then the deal at the Journal was basically you could go out with people, but you had to take turns. So they couldn't just take you to Lutece and Le Cirque and so forth. So we would take turns, and at one point his PR person called and said she was coming with Gates, and did Dennis and I want to have dinner with him? Well, sure. She said it was his turn to buy, so we could pick any restaurant we wanted. And Dennis and I talked and decided that, well, there's probably some ethnic food in New York that you don't get in Seattle. So we asked what Gates's favorite ethnic food was. Turned out it was Thai. And so we asked around and we found the best Thai restaurant in New York. It was this total dive. Dinner for 4 of us cost probably $35, and Gates loved it. So anytime he came to New York after that, he wanted to have dinner with Dennis and me. The last time I had dinner with him, he got confused it was a cheap Japanese restaurant in Seattle, and he grabbed my dinner. And I thought, well, I don't really care. Bill, if you want my dinner, you can have my dinner. So I ate his. Anyway, long answer, but. Michael.
Can you give us an update on what you're doing now?
Sure. Thank you for asking. So I've done a whole bunch of things after my magazine folded. I almost did a book with a guy named Eric Seidel, who's one of the best poker players in the world. Did some other things, wound up at the FCC, wrote or edited basically all of the National Broadband Plan, did this project at the Department of Energy that was similar to that, did the book. At the moment, I'm doing something, I'm the CEO of a startup called insurancethoughtleadership.com. It's basically an online publishing platform for people in the insurance industry, which I think is about to go through the kind of disruption that I've seen a lot of other industries go through over the last 30 years. And the model is what I call nobody is as smart as everybody. So rather than have something where I hire a bunch of reporters and we publish stuff, we just make this very high quality platform open to people in the insurance industry who have good enough ideas and have enough of a reputation that they ought to publish there. And I've never run a startup before. I've covered a lot of them. And I'm learning that there's maybe more pain associated to all this than I realized from the outside. But actually things are going very well.
Out of all the people that you've had the opportunity to interview with, who has impacted you the most?
So the question is, who's affected me, influenced me the most of all the people I've interviewed? It's interesting to put it that way. I would tell you that Gates and Colin Powell and maybe Howard Schultz are the most interesting people I've met. I actually had Howard Schultz make me a cup of coffee in his office. I felt bad for the guy because it was a meeting at about 2 o'clock, and I figure everybody who's in Howard Schultz's office wants him to make a cup of coffee, so poor Schultz is probably just wired all day long. But in terms of, I'd say probably in terms of influence, it was Gates. Partly because I think he's such an impressive guy, and partly because he's the one who finally got me off the fence and got me to write a book. I'd been thinking of doing a book on IBM for a while, and then one day I picked up the phone and it was Gates. I'm not his secretary or whatever. It was, hey Paul, it's Bill. I am so pissed off at IBM that if you want to do a book on IBM, the one you've been talking about, I will help you in every way I can. I will give you every document. I will make everybody available. And I thought, okay, I can do that.
If context is what matters most, can you give us another illustration of how to look for context and figure that out better?
Sure. The question is about how you figure out the context. Well, there are a number of ways, a number of kinds of context that are probably important. The kind of stuff that I've mostly focused on for going on 30 years now is the technology context, because it turns out that things change faster than most people can process. Chunka in his first book talked about the technology disruption curve, because humans tend to look at change as a straight line. You know, things are 10% better this year, and so they're 10% more next year. But technology increases exponentially. You know, in 1980, a gigabyte of memory would cost you $300,000. Today, it'd cost you a nickel. And people just don't process that very well. Lou Gerstner, when he did his book on how he turned around things at IBM, I think he was lucky, but that's another story for another day, complained about how he was in an industry, or the situation at IBM was such that the prices of his computers were going to fall 97% in the course of a decade. That's called Moore's Law. That's what happens every decade. So there was nothing extraordinary about that. So in terms of setting the technology context for where folks are these days, we identified in the new killer apps 6 kinds of technology that we think are going to be transformational. One is mobile devices. You know, these things are becoming medical devices and all kinds of other things. Social media, cameras, which are basically everywhere and will have a big impact. Sensors, which again are basically everywhere. You can track all kinds of things. When people talk about the Internet of Things, they're largely talking about the fact that you can put a little sensor on anything and figure out where things are. I don't know how many of you know it, but actually most of these traffic sites that you see on the internet are just tracking cell phones. They're just figuring out how fast basically sensors in the cell phone are moving, so that way they can spot an accident like that and they can adapt. Another is this the cloud, which a lot of people have talked about. And then the final one is what we call emergent knowledge. Other people tend to talk about big data. To me, it's not the amount of data you have, it's the fact that all kinds of data are becoming available that weren't available before. So for instance, if you're a TV station, you're facing some problems these days because it is now required that you make available online the rates that you charge for political candidates. That you wouldn't think of that as all that big a deal, but by law, TV stations have to provide their lowest rate to candidates. So now anybody looking online can find what the lowest rate is that a TV station will accept for an ad. So it's like knowing what the invoice was on a car when that sort of thing became available 10 years ago. People can now bargain much differently with TV stations than they could before. So that's not a lot of data, but it just happens to be really important data. It was always available, but to get it, you had to go, crawl through TV stations and get into filing cabinets and wait and ask for permission and so forth. And now it's widely available. So there are a lot of things involved, but what we argue in the new killer apps is that you need to think about each of those 6 and think about how they will potentially play out, and get pretty aggressive at looking at the possibilities for cameras and so forth. You know, you can imagine what would happen if people not only set up cameras at traffic lights to watch for red lights and so forth, but were start to sell that data to people. So you could figure out, you know, what kind of cars were going through there, and you could figure out much more about traffic patterns, and you could probably see all kinds of other things. I actually had a better example that I've forgotten, but anyway, that's how we would break down what you need to do in terms of the technology context. And that isn't always enough. Kodak, for instance, back in 1989, did a big study on digital photography, which Kodak, in fact, invented. And they laid out very accurately what the progression would be for digital photography, and still blew it.
Any other questions? Anything? Great. Let's give Paul a hand.
All right, thanks, you guys.